Marika Mikiashvili is an expert on hybrid threats, governance in Europe and Central Asia, and identity in former communist states. She's based in Tbilisi, Georgia, and has been actively following and commenting on the anti-government protest unfolding in Georgia. And of course, we are now speaking again at a crucial time. The election is coming up. The result is not certain. And even if the result goes against the ruling party, there is no guarantee at all that they will respect that. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. We really hope you appreciate these videos. If you do, make sure you add a like and ensure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of the incredible speakers and content. And before we start, I wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who has contributed through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Your support is incredibly meaningful. It's incredibly important to keep this work doing. This channel is the main thing I do now. It's the main way of keeping a roof over my head. I think it has an impact. So if you agree, and if you can, of course, do please help. Before you do that, however, do also check out the validated Ukrainian charities. It's incredibly important to support Ukraine at this time and to help Ukrainians remain resilient in the face of extreme Russian aggression. Marika, welcome back.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Now, of course, Georgia was in the news for a while and then it dropped out. We know that the mainstream Western news is rather fickle, has a very short attention span. So before we dive into some of the complex issues, could you just describe where we're at the moment? What is happening in Georgia? When are the elections coming up? And what are the sort of key information that people should be aware of as background before we start a more analytical discussion?
So, yes, today is the 23rd of October. We have elections on 26th of October. I cannot think of elections more decisive than this in the history of Georgia. Yeah, I don't think I'm exaggerating. So, elections are now a few months after the huge protests against the foreign agents law, so-called Russian law. And the people are obviously very fed up with the government. They want change. The opposition, they consolidated to a certain degree. And we have several opposition coalition alliances right now because the threshold is quite high at the elections. And we are very much hoping for victory. And also, at the same time, we expect all sorts of manipulations and fraud from the government. But if we do not win it, there might be no Georgia left to live in or fight for after these elections. This is our momentum, and we have to do everything to secure victory.
And could you describe the structure of government a little? Because whereas there's this effort to run what is called state capture, and I did an interview with the former head of the intelligence services in Georgia, where if people are interested, they can see we went into the whole detail of how state capture of this type works. But Russian agents have not been able to capture all the organs of government, have they? So the presidency, my understanding, is held by someone who is much more liberal and is not necessarily part of the Georgia dream. In fact, she's appeared with the protesters. How does that play out when you look at things like the sort of judiciary, the church, and other major institutions? Is Georgia Dream able to infiltrate these, capture these, or is there still, enough independent institutions or semi-independent to perhaps have some kind of hope?
Well, unfortunately, the Georgian Dream controls everything in the country. They have captured everything. Other than the presidency, yes, and to a degree also public defender, the ombudsman. However, they do not control the presidency now, not because they didn't have access to presidency, but simply because the persona of the president, Salome Zurabishvili herself, she just she didn't turn out to be as reliable for the government as they thought she was. So in 2018, she was their candidate. Technically, she was independent, but she was heavily endorsed by the government, very heavily and very visibly too, from the first round of her elections to the runoff, it was the government members and oligarch Bidzina Ioanishvili himself who appeared on election banners, sometimes instead of her, because back then she wasn't really popular among the broader masses. So it's simply an unexpected surprise for them that suddenly the president is not as reliable as they hoped for. And for us, she's the biggest positive surprise in Georgian politics of recent decades, I'd say. So that's, let's say, that's a little bit of a miscalculation on their part, why presidency is not theirs. However, she's having her term ended quite soon. And after that, we are not even having direct elections of the president. We'll be having indirect elections by the parliament and by local councils. And for that reason, it's crucial who has the majority in the parliament, because next time the Georgian Dream will not make the same mistake. They will be absolutely sure in the loyalty of the next president, and we will lose the presidency too if we do not win these elections now. So I always say there are several reasons why state capture of such scales happened in Georgia. First of all, is a really bad election laws, a really bad composition of the parliament. We used to have mixed member parliament, so part would be elected with proportional list, another in a majoritarian single constituency. And this created a situation like in Hungary, by the way, which in 2016, for example, the Georgian Dream, they had 48% of national votes, but all single mandate seats, which created the situation where in the parliament they had constitutional majority. They could single-handedly amend the country's everything with just 48% of votes. Another is that Georgia is a very centralized state. The municipalities, they do not have any independence from the center, and they rely on Tbilisi for everything. So whoever controls the parliament, they also control the government, and every level of state administration from every single village and so on. And the third factor, but last but not the least, certainly, personal wealth of Bidzina Ioanishvili, the oligarch who is behind this government, whose government it is. It's basically his puppet government, we could say that. He's insanely wealthy for Georgia. In 2015, his personal assets compared to national GDP was 35%. The guy controls everything in financial and in administrative and executive, legislative sense. Yes, the presidency is a lucky miscalculation on their part about the president's personality and character. Yeah.
And of course, that wealth was earned in Moscow. We'll come back to that in a minute and his connections to Moscow. But staying on the topic of state capture, I've spoken to people who are of, let's say, a cynical turn of mind who are from Serbia, and they're describing to me some of the aspects of state capture there and how Moscow exerts its influence. It doesn't invade states if it's managed to hollow them out and turn them into a sort of puppet or an asset. And they were describing the process whereby, Russia will register tons and tons of businesses. So you have this through flow of money. Then they will start to involve senior people in the military and the police, either in corrupt schemes or in compromat or directly in business arrangements. They'll make them complicit in crimes, which means these people can be manipulated. Once you do that, it's easy to control the politicians as well, because they will each keep an eye on the other. They're all involved. They're all complicit in crimes. Therefore, you can manipulate and put pressure on them. We're not naming any names here because obviously we don't want to get sued, but that's the sort of idea of how this works. How does this play out in Georgia, and what's the position in, say, the military, senior police roles, and even the church? Does this same system of sort of, bribes, complicit businesses, compromat, is that same process sort of playing out in Georgia as well?
Yes, they do play dirty. They do keep the loyalty of their network intact through blackmail, through pressure, intimidation, having compromise. Um, uh, yes, indeed, it is the case. However, in case of Georgian military and Georgian police, not everything is so monolithic. So, what helps Georgians resist this state capture and have some hope for a free democratic European future is the national identity, basically. This European identity is very deeply entrenched into Georgian minds, and nothing represents it better than the Georgian army. They know full well who the enemy is, because now the government they're trying to flip friends and enemies. That the European Union is not our friend and the United States is not our friend, and they are just danger and basically enemies to Georgia. They're not quite yet saying that Russia is the friend, but give them a couple more months if they retain power, and they will. And the Georgian army, they are very strong on this identity matter, and also they remember that it has always been the West who equipped them, who trained them, who treated them well and as equals, in Afghanistan, for example, at ISAF mission, where Georgia was heavily represented, and who the enemy is, which is Russia, of course. So in that regard, we are lucky that our army is not captured by the state. However, the army is very seldom a factor in Georgia at all, because we have this tradition of complete neutrality of the army. I think that if the army expresses their opinion, it's probably just bloodbaths outside in the streets. So army is surprisingly not a factor in politics in Georgia. As for police, how to say? So I'm not sure if identity is that big of a factor with police, but at least Georgia is a very small country. Whenever someone resorts to violence, it resonates very significantly, because everyone knows everyone in this country. Like, if you shoot someone, they might turn out to be your relative or even your family member or your best friend's family member. So there is a bit of a social pressure in terms of behaving in this country within some norms of conduct. And also many enablers of the regime, and I don't mean this highest level of regime members and the representatives, but like the bureaucracy and the law enforcement on which this regime stands to exist, so like people who are more or less everyday people, more or less, they're not with the Georgian dream for the sake of ideology, for ideological convictions. They're there for benefits and social status and so on. So that's why if you take that away, then they have much less incentives to strengthen the regime and to work for them, basically. That's why travel bans, and especially on family members of the enablers of the regime, is very painful for them. And the United States, they have imposed travel bans on dozens of people who undermine democracy in Georgia and resort to violence, and their family members as well. So I would say that state capture in Georgia definitely works in a similar way as in other countries that are influenced heavily by the Kremlin. However, there are these local peculiarities and local factors too, like identity, but also to a degree, I suppose we have been in the last decades under Soviet times, incorporated into the Soviet mechanisms and KGB even more than Serbia, let's say, because still Yugoslavia had its own thing and they were not fully aligned with the Soviet Union. The Church of Georgia, for example, as you mentioned, they are the bishops and the high echelons of the church. They're educated in the Russian church, basically, and under KGB, and also KGB would not approve of high appointments, if they were independent. They had to be loyal. So I'm not saying that all high representatives of the Church of Georgia are Russian assets, but many of them are. Many of them are directly coming from the Russian church establishments, basically, and educated under KGB, appointed with KGB's approval, and so on. Some of them might be ideologically loyal to all of that system, but then there's another part, which is again a convenience and status thing. The Georgian opposition is not how to say is not really willing to there are differences among opposition parties, but overall the Georgian opposition and people who vote for opposition are not willing to give the church as many benefits, including material benefits, as the Georgian dream, because the Georgian dream and the high echelons of the church, they are two fingers of the same hand in terms of this Russian influence and the lifestyle that they offer, the post-Soviet, corrupt, I don't know, pseudo-moral lifestyle. So they are mutually reinforcing each other, because even if they dislike each other, they are the mutual guarantees of the same lifestyle and order in the state that they want to live in. Yeah.
So that's talking about traditional values while owning yachts and
Of
watches that
course.
cost tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah, we know how that works, and we know the optics of that as well. When it comes to the media, so this sounds like a very dangerous situation when you have one individual that accounts for a huge, an extraordinary, ridiculous chunk of GDP. Does that mean the idea of a sort of independent media is very, very difficult to contemplate? Because clearly, with that much money, you can control an awful lot. Are there still independent media voices? Are they legacy, or are they digital? How's the state capture vis-a-vis the media work? Because of course, very early in Putin's regime, he started to corrupt, co-opt, take over the media environment in Russia right from the very earliest years of his rule there, and created this sort of illusion of plurality rather, the sort of hybrid media environment. How's that worked in Georgia?
Well, actually, surprisingly, we do have independent media, more than a country captured as much as Georgia would probably have. But it's not because the governments didn't try capturing them all. It's, I think, a combination of like personal dedication and personal heroism of the media personalities and journalists and media managers, coupled with the fact that yes, the government tried to capture them with like covert means, but to a degree they did want to maintain some window-dressed image of democracy and pro-Westernism. So that's why until quite recently the broader masses of the population did not necessarily see them as pro-Russians and Russians outright and anti-European. They do marquee business, but they try to avoid doing it in black and white, so that the opposition against them does not consolidate both at home and abroad. So yes, the personal dedication and a little bit of window dressing of events caused Georgian media to be to a degree independent. So we have several big opposition leaning TV channels and online media, of course. But again, it's not to say that they didn't try to silence us. There's prosecution against most media managers and owners. Also, Rustaviori, there was one TV channel which they basically took away from its owners through some forged legislative process. And then they thought that's it. They have silenced Rustavi 2. But the people behind Rustavi 2, they just crafted a new TV channel out of nothingness and with very few resources. But again, why I underline heroism is that they for months, sometimes the journalists and camera people, they have had their salaries delayed because the opposition-leaning TV channels do not have as much funding as like sometimes they can barely function. They deliver, but behind the scenes they're really struggling. And for example, yeah, in Georgia in general, there is the problem of funding. So there are very, very few business people who would agree to fund something that the government does not like, let alone that's something outright against the government. Because yes, there's no independent money in Georgia, and whatever there is, they are afraid that the government will crack down on them and the captured judiciary will close down their business overnight. That's why Georgian civil society depends vitally on Western money, and that's why the foreign agents law is a problem. One of the, like, I'll not go into details now, but yeah, so there's no local funding. So that's it. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned something really interesting about the regime. So you've got all of this sort of semi-legal and in some ways, unconstitutional illegal behaviors to try and capture more and more components of the state. But you say at the same time that the regime seems to fear losing international credibility, losing international legitimacy. I find that a kind of extraordinary idea, why they're still trying to hold on to that when it's becoming clearer and clearer they're coming within the orbit of Moscow, which is now a rogue state and is pretty much burnt its bridges when it comes to legitimacy, at least with Western democracies. Why is this? And what can the West perhaps do to put pressure on the Georgia Dream Party if it is still concerned about its so-called international legitimacy?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, I would say a large part of it owes to the fact that population in Georgia is very pro-Western and very pro-European. 85% of people consistently want European integration. And even some voters of government still, there's an overlap between those who want European integration and those who vote for the government too. So some people they're manipulated by the propaganda to think that it's still possible to become EU members with the Georgian Dream government, which is not right. But eventually they do want European integration. So that's why the government fears clarity that much. They want to keep things gray. They want things not to be obvious because it's not really possible to, how to say, have any support popularity in Georgia if you are an anti-Western force. And that's why whatever they do, they still keep maintain saying that they are pro-EU and they want European integration. And I would suppose, like, if Georgia is isolated internationally, if the visa-free regime to the European Union is revoked, if there are sanctions, and if Georgians feel that they've been cut off from the West for real, beyond statements, for example, the country might become ungovernable for the government because, as I said, their pillars of enablers, they're not necessarily ideologically loyal to them. They've been like, usually they say, oh, I don't care about politics. I'm just doing my job. I'm assigned to do this. So like whatever, the politicians will sort it out like between themselves. So if it's like beyond politics and if the people assume that it's how to say, it's actually like life defining for them, then the government will have a huge problem of legitimacy. And as I said, they don't have the army, and even police is not entirely unconditionally loyal to them, not least so because Georgia is a small country, everyone knows everyone, and violence resonates very deeply. And I don't think that many police officers in Georgia would just shoot people on command. It's very unlikely. That's why the Georgian Dream, they try to not get things to that edge. They not having any clarity, and the gray zone is their best friend. That's why. But also, like, Georgia is a small country. We depended on, yes, like population. We depend also on economically, mentally, like on identity base, on the Western connections. And the setting and the everyday picture of living in Georgia would be absolutely different without the West. That's why they do care about Western legitimacy, but also because, yes, they will just lose their enablers if that's not the case. But also, if the elections are deemed illegitimate, if the rule is illegitimate, there are also coming sanctions for many more regime representatives than we have now. And also probably personally Bidzina Ivanishvili, the oligarch too. And he loves his money very much. Just a couple of days ago, he had an exclusive interview at his propaganda TV media, and half of the interview he spoke about some money that was the assets was frozen for him in a Swiss bank, and then anyway, it's a big story, but he cannot digest it. He cannot get over it. Yes, and these guys, this Ivanishvili and his puppets, like Russians, they never really expect the West to act beyond words. So they dare a lot, not anticipating anything much in response. Yes, and what the West can do, if I have to choose just one word, it's that clarity. Georgian people need clarity. Of course, the statements from the European Union, from the US, have been very clear lately. The European Union outright says there's no European integration, basically, under this government or whatever. But clarity in international monitoring of the elections, that's what I mean. Now that's very urgent, very pressing. If they do see manipulation, fraud, rigging, they should not beautify the language. It's no time for diplomatic language. They should call white white and black black. That's what we say. Because if that's not the case, and if the people think that there has been fraud and the elections are rigged, but the observation missions are a bit more delicate in wording, then regime enablers and useful idiots will say, see, the opposition just wants revolution. The West said that it was okay. And sanctions, a threat of sanctions, really heavy, and the like package is ready, like the package is ready. I'm just pressing the button to enact them if the elections are stolen. That's what the West can do. Georgian people appreciate support of the West, but also criticism of the government. So sometimes some Westerners, some Europeans, they think that if they cut off ties with the government of Georgia, then the Georgian people will be angry with the European Union, like take it as a humiliation or insult or something. But no, actually Georgian people, if they are ever angry at something, is that the European Union continues business as usual with the government. And their anger is directed to the government, whatever happens, not to the European Union. Whatever happens in this particular setting, yeah, of course.
And this need to try and maintain this quasi-legitimacy, does that explain the role partly of Tushki? So if they can't rely on the army, they can't necessarily rely on the police, they have to use these irregular street thugs in order to exert sort of violence and pressure. And if it was a choice between legitimacy and losing power or losing the election and not being able to sort of complete the state capture, would they jettison this idea of legitimacy and would they go for imported, let's say, sort of Russian violence, such as the Berkut, which we saw deployed in Kiev after Maidan? What are the risks here, and how do we go from Titushki to full full Moscow-oriented or ordered violence to try and complete state capture?
Um, yes, those are really insightful, great questions. As for Titushki, yes, I think partially it's because they do not want all violence to be attributed to the police. So it's not that they wouldn't find individual police people who do that. And quite often people say that some of the Titushki are police people dressed into civilian clothes. It's, I think, to take the blame of the police and partially, and the other part is that they want to create the image as if it's a citizen versus a citizen. So they want to make it look like it's a civic conflict. That a citizen is so outraged by the opposition and by the protests that he cannot just restrain himself and he punches someone. So they create this fear of a civic war, basically. Yes, because it's very traumatic for Georgians. We've been through that in the 90s, and they want to like play on our fears of civic confrontation, that it's people versus people, not people versus the government. And on a human level too, like they want you to not be feeling secure at any point. If somebody next to you standing is a police officer, you kind of expect the danger. But if you are standing between, I don't know, some people dressed in civilian outfits, you do not necessarily expect the danger. And but now you do. Now that they deploy Titushkis, you do, and you do not feel secure anywhere, basically. So this is a part of a psychological warfare, I think. In terms of legitimacy versus keeping the power, well, of course, they would not yield to the legitimacy question simply out of moral considerations and all of that. But if they do not have legitimacy internationally, it might simply be very difficult for them to cling to power because their pillars of enablers might just like refuse to protect their rule. So they have to have people who would enforce their rule, and it's questionable to what degree the Georgian police would do that. And the army is not theirs, and just not a factor in Georgian politics, as I said. Like they remain as neutral as possible always. And then we're going to whether it's possible to import these Russian forces and Berkut or Russian army or something. Well, in theory, of course, many of us have had that concern. But considering how things are going with Russia's war in Ukraine, we do not think Russia is capable of like paying that much attention to Georgia in a conventional sense. And in terms of some infiltrated people like Berkut, I would say that again, it's an issue that the country will just become ungovernable. These Georgian police people, I don't think they are okay with cracking down on Georgians together with Russians. So it's usually a problem of perception that the police does not fully comprehend that we're dealing with Russia now, because unfortunately, with Georgia not having a state for centuries, basically, we have a bit of a crooked understanding of statehood. Well, we did have a state, but like at least last 250 years we were under centuries was a bit of an exaggeration, but like yeah, from the beginning of the 19th century we are under Russia. Yeah. So we have a crooked understanding of statehood in the sense that many people in Georgia think that since we have our own de jure statehood, we have our flag, and we speak our language, we eat Georgian, drink Georgian, that's fine. So the actual political independence, actual democracy, freedom, all of that, some people lack the comprehension that that is an integral part of statehood and independence too, especially for Georgia, because if we don't have freedom and democracy, Russia just swallows us, if not on paper, then in essence, for sure. They are happy with the minimum, some people in Georgia, because they're not familiarized with the actual concept of statehood. Usually peoples in Russia, they are, some of them have their languages preserved, they have their traditional clothing. I know people in Georgia who would be absolutely okay with just eating Georgian, drinking Georgian, dressing Georgian outfits, and not having any political independence. But if you actually put a Russian next to such a person to shoot at a Georgian or crack down on a Georgian, then they're like, wait a minute, am I actually defending Russians here? So, so they will not have any existing Georgian security system supporting them. Then they would need to have the entire force of Russians, thousands and thousands of Russian special forces cracking down on Georgians. And again, like, it's way too risky for them, because then the Georgian army would probably not stay neutral, come out and start confrontation, shooting this Russian Berkut. So you do need to have your own significant base of security support in your country, and the imported force is an auxiliary force, I would say. It cannot be a main force, especially when the Georgian army could give a response to that. So that's why them enforcing their rule militarily or with police force is a very big question. And that's why if the turnout at the elections is very high, and if the international assessments are also critical in case of fraud, very critical in case of fraud, they will most probably not have any other option but to accept it. So we can force them to accept peaceful transfer of power with the voter turnout and international assessments. In theory, what I worry more about than this outright crackdowns would be, what if they manipulate these elections in a very targeted manner to trap some of the parties below the threshold? And in that case, whatever stays below the threshold, they are pocketing most of the percentages. So in theory, the Georgian Dream could get, I don't know, 33, 35% or something, but then trap another 10% below the threshold, take all their mandates, and I don't know, then probably also try to bribe individual opposition members of the parliament to form a government together with them, to defect from the opposition to form a government together with them. So I would be very wary of their manipulation of threshold, because if any party is in single digits and the threshold is 5%, if any party is like 8 or something, I'm in theory worried for them. And there's indications that some parties have like 7, 8 or something. There should be last polls this evening, by the way. So I would fear their manipulations of the legal framework and individual bribing and all of that more. At this point, at least, in the run-up to elections and immediately during the elections. and then let's see how it goes. If the turnout is high, we can overwhelm them. I'm sure we can force them to accept defeat because this wind of change that is outside in the air in Georgia, it has only been out there in 2012, which unseated the previous government and brought these guys to power. So let's see. I'm hopeful. We have reason to be hopeful, but also, of course, we cannot relax, and we cannot celebrate victory before it actually happens, so before we actually hold government power, because after all, this is the last Russian government in Georgia. They can no further rely on anyone, not least so because we'll have a proportional representation in the parliament, and no single party will be able to capture the country over years and years, as they did. They came as pro-Europeans, captured everything, and in 10 years they began unmasking themselves as Russians. Well, experts circles, of course, knew things before, but I mean for the broader masses and popularity matter. So yeah.
The mask has fallen away. It's become more obvious. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but it would be fantastic to catch up with you after the election result. And I imagine there will be drama and there'll be things to unlock. And then we'll possibly see more of that mask slipping after that. But Marika, I'm so pleased you could join us once again to describe what is essentially a much more complicated situation than just simple state capture, and a much more challenging one, actually, for Moscow, because the wrong decision, the wrong pressure, it seems it could go badly wrong for them. And Putin is not known for his subtlety, so this could be quite interesting. But I look forward to my next conversation. We are all, on this channel at least, thinking of the Georgian people and with you in this critical time. Yes, it is concerning, but just the spirit of people and their willingness not to be controlled and dominated, I think hopefully that will come to the fore and triumph. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. I look forward to meeting you again.